Welcome back to the Canine Campus podcast. This is episode 12, and in this show, we're going to be answering a listener question about leash aggression, the causes and cures of this fairly common yet highly disconcerting problem. Before we start, we wanted to let you know that this was actually recorded as part of an earlier show, but after taking a listen, we decided that it deserved its own space and also wanted to add some clarification to the second part of the show. Our thanks to Mark and Lizzie for sending in their question as an MP3 file so that we could use it, and we welcome you to do the same. Feel free to write us an email, or if you're really motivated, like Mark, send us an MP3 attachment. If that seems a bit too much work, you can also leave a voicemail via the cool new MobiTalk audio comment system on our homepage at caninecampus.com. We'll look forward to hearing from you, and without further ado, here's Devin.
I want to start with Mark Harris. He was actually the first person that ever emailed us when we started podcasting. And he emailed us about his dog, Lizzie. He had some on-leash aggression issues with Lizzie that had some basis in health issues.
Hi, just a quick message to say thanks for producing a great podcast. I love the way that they're both informative and they're also a bit humorous too, so it always keeps me interested, and I'm looking forward to the next episode. A topic I would be really interested to hear your views on is fear aggression. I, 3 months ago, became the happy owner of a German Shepherd who's now 10 months old. Unfortunately, she has a fear of people she doesn't know. And this means that if people get too close, she will suddenly just bark at them and then lunge at them. Initially, this was very bad. She would bark and lunge at anybody on the streets and in the park. Now we've been working with the trainer, and that's actually helped a lot. Now she tends to only bark after a period of time when I've been talking to someone that she doesn't know. And also quite difficult is barking and lunging at the vet as well. They obviously have to be very careful with her. Obviously I really feel sorry for our dog, who obviously finds the whole thing very stressful. It's also very difficult for us, not only the general situations we get into and where we can take her to, but also from training point of view as well. She'll be fine for a few days and then just suddenly something will happen so that she will bark at strangers again, which knocks your confidence because you're not quite sure what she's going to do and how she's going to respond in certain situations. To strangers, she's a real Jekyll and Hyde. One minute they're a lovable puppy, and then the next minute a raging wolf bearing down on them. This is particularly difficult if we don't know them, or if they're not dog owners and don't understand. So I wondered whether or not you had any tips and suggestions for what we could do and how we could help her. Thanks.
Where's Mark from?
I think Switzerland, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
And what I think is important about this, on-leash aggression is one of the most common reasons that people hire me. It is something that can be worked on and improved greatly. So for those of you out there that have a dog that can be snarky on leash, that is not the end of the world, and there are definitely ways that you can improve that. And a couple of things that Mark's email and my continued correspondence with him has brought up I thought would be helpful for other people. One of which is health issues. Some of Lizzie's behavior has been attributed to some health issues that she's having. And I wanted to let everyone know that if you talk to a vet, statistics suggest that potentially 40% of behavior issues can have a basis in physical issues. So whenever you're looking at your dog's behavior, if this is a new behavior, if you've had a dog for a certain amount of time and all of a sudden a kind of new behavior presents itself, like on-leash aggression or house training accidents when your dog's been house trained for 3 or 4 years, it really can be helpful to look at health issues. In fact, if someone calls me and says my dog was house trained and in the last month my dog has not been house trained, I usually steer them to a vet to make sure it's not a urinary tract infection.
It's a great place to start the process.
Right. So I don't want to suggest that all behavior issues, necessarily have a grounding in physical issues, but it's a good place to start, and it's always good to rule out the physical, especially when you're doing behavior modification. What happens when you have a dog with on-leash aggression is you sort of get socially ostracized. Even if you ostracize yourself, it's embarrassing, right? You're out walking your dog's snarky. It's embarrassing, especially if you live in a dog community.
Right.
And what happens then is you stop taking your dog out. And that only makes the problem worse. So I'm not suggesting, by the way, that if your dog has on-leash aggression, you should go to the nearest dog park, because that is not necessarily going to be a good decision.
But where do we start with this? If we've eliminated that there's a medical issue, then what's the first step?
Well, there's a lot of things I ask when people call me about on-leash aggression. The first is, how does the dog do off-leash?
Right.
And fully 75% of the dogs that I work with that have on-leash issues, if the leash is not present, they're fine. They play well with other dogs.
Really?
The leash adds a lot of things to the equation, more than you can imagine. It introduces barrier frustration. There's a four-legged friend. I'd like to go out and see what's going on with that four-legged friend, and I can't get there.
Right.
So there's barrier frustration. Often owners tighten up on the leash when other dogs approach, and they're stressed and they're tensed, and that goes down the leash.
Right, so that exacerbates the problem.
It also completely ruins the dog's greeting rituals.
Right.
So if you watch dogs approach each other, they often do it at a curve. And Turid Rugas, who's written some great books on this, Calming Signals, What Your Dog is Telling You, has a video on this. But it's dogs approach each other often with a wide arc, and of course they're smelling nose and fanny. As one of my clients calls it, first name, last name, which I think is sort of delightful. And so, we tend to walk right up to other dogs on leash. They're tightly controlled on the leash. They can't arc. We bring them up face to face, which is very rude. If you watch dogs, they often approach from the side. So a huge component of the on-leash issues can be the humans that are orchestrating it. Those are questions I ask. If this is a dog that doesn't like dogs, period, whether they're on leash or off leash, it's not that we're necessarily going to be able to train this dog to love other dogs, but we can train this dog to exhibit alternate behavior in the presence of other dogs. But we will also manage this. If I'm with a dog that doesn't like other dogs, I'm not going to force that dog to interact with other dogs.
Right.
I'm going to teach that dog that, hey, there are alternate behaviors like looking at me, sitting, and if I can get those, there's a lovely reward in it for you, and I will not force you to interact with that dog at all. There could be fear issues behind it. There's a lot of things behind on-leash aggression, and I don't want to kind of minimize by giving a 5-minute answer on how to deal with it. Right. In general, when I deal with on-leash aggression, I desensitize and counter condition. So this is pure classical conditioning that Pavlov gave us. I find a treat that the dog loves more than anything in the world, and the only time they get that treat is in the presence of other dogs. I start at a very great distance so the dog can take treats and is not too stressed out. My goal when I'm desensitizing is to be at such a distance from other dogs that there are no reactions. There are no negative reactions. Right. So what I really want to tell the listeners out there, if you have on-leash aggression as an issue with your dog, definitely call some trainers, because that will not only get you working on the problem, it will get your dog out and more social, which is only going to help things. It's going to make you feel better knowing that other people have this very same issue. And one of the things that was interesting is, for the most part, Mark had been working privately and one-on-one, and recently he got into a group class and felt immediately better because, I'm in a class with other people that have the same challenges that I do. I'm not alone.
Right.
And then what happens when you're in that kind of environment, if your dog does have a reaction to another dog, you don't have to explain yourself. You don't have to be embarrassed. Everyone knows what's going on. Everyone knows the training protocol.
Right. So it's a more controlled environment for working.
It's more controlled environment, and I think it's a really supportive environment. So do not think that this is just the way it's going to be and that you can't improve it greatly. Now, there are some cases where pharmaceuticals are involved. Those are more extreme cases. And when I work with a vet in town, and when pharmaceuticals are prescribed, it's often to get the behavior modification program rolling with the goal of weaning off the pharmaceuticals. But in the vast majority of on-leash aggression cases I work on, pharmaceuticals are not involved. So, but it is not a lost cause. And there's a couple of great books on this. There's Patricia McConnell, who we've talked about a lot in the past. She has a small book on this called Feisty Fido. It's about 30 pages. It's completely on point, practical, great reference. There's also The Cautious Canine, because often this can be a fear-based behavior. That's also by Patricia McConnell. It's a small book. Mark found that book very helpful. And Emma Parsons has written a book, Healing the Aggressive Dog. She had a very aggressive golden retriever, and she used clicker training to do it. So that's another good resource.
Excellent. Well, I know Mark and you have emailed several times beginning several months ago. Mark, thanks for your letter, and do drop us a line and let us know how things are going.
Yes, I'd
with
love
you
to
and
know how
Lizzie.
things are going with Lizzie.
Okay, it's been a few weeks since we actually answered Mark's question and recorded this podcast, but we didn't finish it up because there were a few things that you wanted to add to it.
Right, and listening to the original podcast, I realized that I talked about the beginning of the classical conditioning process, but I didn't really flesh it out in a useful fashion. So when talking about using Pavlov's classical conditioning for leash aggression, what I try to do is have the dog believe that that which scares her, whether it's other people, whether it's other dogs, but that which scares her is the predictor of really excellent things. So you start out with a food treat that they're absolutely bananas for, because you're trying to actually transfer that emotional reaction to the trigger of their fear.
The reaction to the food.
The reaction to the food. And so think, this is purely Pavlov. When the dog started salivating, when the metronome rang, most people think it was a bell, but it was actually a metronome. What was going on there is their emotional reaction towards the food had been transferred to what originally was a neutral stimuli, the metronome, but now that stimuli trigger had meaning.
Right.
So that's what I'm trying to do when I use classical conditioning and behavior modification, particularly with fear issues and on-leash aggression. So I find this treat that the dog is absolutely bananas for, like you bring it out and they wag their tail and they dance and they skip and they can't be happier. And the only time they get this treat is in the presence of their fear trigger. And the second their fear trigger goes away, so does the treat. So I started a pretty good distance from other dogs, if that's the fear trigger, or from people. And because I want to be far enough away that the dog can actually take the treat. If they're really fearful or really stressed out, they will not take the treat. Right. Now, whether they take the treat or not is irrelevant initially, because when you start doing classical conditioning, you need to figure out where your parameters are, and you can only do that by doing some test cases. So what most people don't understand about this process is that the dog's behavior isn't really relevant. It's only relevant insofar as it tells you if you're working in too close a range. Right. What's much more important is your behavior. The handler's behavior must be completely consistent. There's something scary, here's the food. There's something scary, here's this amazing treat you never see any other time. Whether the dog can take it or not, whether the dog is freaking out or not, irrelevant. That trigger causes the presence of this amazing treat. So if you present it and the dog is too scared or preoccupied by the trigger to eat it, all that tells you is you started too close to the trigger.
Right.
But once again, your behavior doesn't change. So at that point, you get another 20 feet away, but you find that magic spot where they notice the trigger, but they are still able to take the food. And of course, you want a hungry dog when you do this.
Right, exactly.
So basically, you try to set this up where they don't see the dog for 30 seconds. It's really helpful if you work down an alley in a street where a dog can walk in front of the alley and they see the trigger for 10 seconds and then it's gone.
So you're using the environment to kind of limit
it. Can be really helpful because it's like, oh, there's the trigger, here's the food, the trigger goes away, the food goes away. Right. And you really want them to have that. So one of the places that I worked with Silly, after being in a dog fight, one of our dogs, Silly, started to, for the next few days, was barking at other dogs and pretty fearful of other dogs, understandably so. He'd been in a horrible dog fight. So I sat outside my vet's office, and I sat about 40, 50 feet away from the door, and I had, smoked ham, which he'd never had any other time and really seemed to like a lot. And every single time a dog went in or out, here came the smoked ham. And it was limited, right? If dogs were going in, they were just going from the car to the door or from the door to the car. So there was this short window period of time. Silly was way far away from it all. If he barked, I didn't care. If he growled, I didn't care. It didn't matter what he did. The food was there. And I actually, in the end, think he thought it was the door opening or closing that was causing the food and not the other dogs. But that's how you perfect your technique as you go on, as you go on. But so what are you looking for? Well, No reaction from the dog, no negative reaction from the dog. Like I said, if you have one, you're too close and you need to back up. And what you start playing with are the variables. So once you're sort of consistently, getting the food out there in the presence of the trigger, you start setting it up so the trigger stays a little bit longer and then goes away. Or instead of just walking by, the trigger walks in, pauses for a few seconds, then walks by. This takes hundreds of repetitions. This is not we're going to solve this problem in a week or a month. I mean, this is, depending on how often you practice, you're looking at 3 to 6 months of pretty consistent work. It's also really helpful if you can control your dog's exposure to the trigger unless it's a training situation. Sometimes that's possible, sometimes it's not. It's really important in the first 7 to 10 days.
Okay. Now, something else that you mentioned was spontaneous
recovery. One of the things Mark brought up is that, a few days would go by and things would be going well, and then she'd have a bad day. And, and so it was kind of Mr. Heckle, was it Heck? Dr. Heckle, Mr. Hyde. And what Mark is encountering is called
Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So what Mark is encountering is called spontaneous recovery. Imagine that the dog's fear reaction to people and other dogs is a path in the woods. So they see the trigger and they go down that path in the woods where they're barking and they're lunging and they're behaving in a fashion that you're not comfortable with.
Right.
When you start doing behavior modification, you are, in effect, cutting another path in the woods. And what you want to try to do is minimize the opportunity for them to go down the old path. Because every time they go down the old path, they keep it clear. And you want it to overgrow. And you want this new path to be the path that is the most tread upon. But it's inevitable, whenever you're working on something like this, that they head down the old path. It's the most familiar, it's the most comfortable. And so they call that in psychology spontaneous recovery. And it doesn't mean that your behavior modification is not working. It just means that, and it doesn't mean you're starting from scratch either. So one of the things Mark said is, it's very disconcerting and it's very kind of depressing. Like you feel like, am I getting anywhere?
It's frustrating.
It's frustrating, but you are getting somewhere. And the next time it'll be a little longer before spontaneous recovery. But spontaneous recovery is to be expected. And how much spontaneous recovery you get, how intense it is, how long it lasts, completely depends upon how successfully they have exhibited the behavior up to that point. So, for example, Silly started this fear growling behavior, and within 24 hours, I was counter conditioning.
Right.
He had a very short period of time to practice it. It wasn't a well-worn path in his brain. So when I started working on an alternate path, no, those things really cause, shaved ham to happen, and isn't that great? I wasn't competing with a well-worn path. So I haven't seen spontaneous recovery with him because I was on it so quickly and it was such a new behavior. But if your dog's done this for 5 years, it's going to be a year or two where every once in a while spontaneous recovery is going to kick in. If your dog's done it for 6 months, maybe it'll be 6 months or a year. And I think Gene Donaldson in Culture Clash actually has charts of this. I think there's even an algorithm. Knowing Gene Donaldson, there probably is. But anyway, it's called spontaneous recovery. It does not mean your behavior modification is not working. It's to be expected. And, one of the really hard things about any kind of behavior modification, but classical conditioning in particular, it really helps if you're in a lab environment where everything is controlled, where the only time they see the trigger is when the goodies are present. And one of the hiccups I ran into with Silly is I was taking him to the vet's office. I had the shaved ham in my pocket, but it wasn't at the ready. And as we were driving, we passed someone walking a dog.
Right.
Well, he reacted, and I wasn't ready. So I'm like scrambling for the ham, and I'm like, ugh. So there's a pretty hardcore percentage. And it goes like this. If 100% of the time the dog sees the trigger, this amazing treat occurs, you have a much greater chance of changing their behavior.
Sure.
If 70% of the time they see the trigger and get food, but 30% of the time they don't, it almost won't work.
Wow. So training, back to your point, the consistency in training training is the most important part.
And controlling your environment, which is really challenging. And so, what you're basically, here's the big thing you're looking for. You want to get to the point where your dog sees the trigger and looks at you and jumps up and down and says, where's my treat? Where's my treat? Where's my treat?
Right.
And at that point, you know that your dog now is associating the trigger. Your dog is having a different emotional reaction to the trigger. And it's at that point that you can say, well, you can have the treat, but sit first. Right. So that's when you can actually start asking your dog to make decisions once you've changed their emotional reaction. But that takes months. And like I said, first you work at a distance, and then you increase the duration that your dog's exposed to the trigger. Then you decrease the duration and decrease the distance. Then you increase the duration. So it actually really helps to keep a log of what you're doing.
Excellent. Good deal. Okay, well, thanks. That I think that helped clears up a few of the things that we wanted to add in.